In the depths of the remote research facility, nestled in a desolate part of the planet, Dr. Evan Klein adjusted his glasses and hunched over a set of complex blueprints on his desk. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the lab's dim fluorescent lights. He had been studying the artifact for days, unable to make sense of the strange symbols etched onto its surface. The artifact was a relic, possibly thousands of years old, uncovered during an excavation on the edge of the galaxy. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Its design was entirely alien, its purpose still unknown. But something about it intrigued him. Something deep within his scientific instinct told him that this was no ordinary find. Evan's fingers traced the lines of the artifact, his mind racing with possibilities. The material it was made from was unlike any known substance, and the intricate carvings seemed to tell a story he couldn't decipher. Perhaps if he could unlock its secrets, he would make a groundbreaking discovery, one that would propel his career into the stratosphere. But as he leaned closer, something unexpected happened. A soft click echoed through the air, followed by a sudden and unnerving pulse of energy that surged from the artifact, sending a ripple of static through the room. He jerked back, heart racing, as the room seemed to come alive. The glow from the artifact shifted from a dull hue to a brilliant blue, casting an eerie light across the cold, metallic walls. Evan stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat as he looked at the object in disbelief. It was activating, just as he had hoped. But in that moment, something else shifted in the atmosphere, a presence that Evan couldn't explain. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, so silently and swiftly that he didn't even hear the footsteps. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps the result of his exhaustion. But when the figure moved into full view, Evan's heart skipped a beat. Standing before him was a woman, an alien, unmistakable in her appearance. Her skin shimmered with a faint iridescence, and her hair flowed like liquid silver, cascading down her back in waves. Her eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto his with a gaze that seemed to pierce through him. Evan's mind raced, confusion flooding his thoughts. He had heard of extraterrestrial life, of course, but to see one in front of him, standing in the flesh, was beyond comprehension. He took a cautious step backward, unsure whether he should speak, run, or simply stand frozen in place. The woman didn't speak, but her presence alone was enough to convey something far deeper than words. The artifact hummed again, a strange, magnetic pulse emanating from it. The woman's gaze shifted toward the object, and her eyes narrowed slightly, as if recognizing something Evan could not. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the surface of the artifact. The moment her skin made contact with the alien device, the room seemed to hold its breath. The artifact's light intensified, flickering like a dying star, and a low mechanical sound filled the air. Evan watched, transfixed, as a symbol that had previously been hidden beneath layers of intricate patterns appeared, its shape unfamiliar, like a key unlocking something unknown. The woman's eyes flashed with urgency, and before Evan could react, she stepped back, her expression clouded with a mix of fear and determination. The artifact pulsed once more, and this time, it seemed to reverberate deep within Evan's chest, almost as if it were speaking directly to him. He felt a strange warmth spread through him, then an icy chill, as if something had been awakened within him, something linked to this moment. "You shouldn't have touched it," the woman finally spoke, her voice soft, but carrying an underlying force that made Evan's blood run cold. The words were cryptic, and the tone of her voice suggested something far more serious than she was letting on. She glanced nervously toward the artifact, her brow furrowing as the room around them seemed to vibrate with increasing intensity. Evan tried to speak, to ask what she meant, but the words caught in his throat. His mind raced as the alien's words settled into his consciousness. He had triggered something. He didn't know what, but he could feel it in his bones. Something had been set in motion, something he couldn't undo, no matter how hard he tried. The woman looked at him then, her eyes softening just for a moment before the urgency returned. She took a step closer, her gaze flicking between him and the artifact, her movements cautious but purposeful. "We must leave," she said quietly, though there was no fear in her voice, only a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her very being. Evan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind spinning with questions. Why had she appeared now? And why had the artifact responded to her touch? What was it that he had awakened? And more importantly, what was coming next? Before he could ask, the door to the lab slammed open with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. In an instant, the woman's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and anger, and even realized, in that moment, that their troubles were just beginning. What had he gotten himself into? And who, or what, had just walked through that door? The room seemed to constrict around Evan, the air thick with tension. His heart raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, as the door crashed open, and the unsettling sound of heavy boots echoed through the hall. The woman, this alien, this being of unknown origin, stood motionless, her eyes locked onto the door, her body tense, poised like a predator ready to flee or fight. Evan barely had time to process what was happening before the figure entered, tall and imposing, dressed in black armor that shimmered with a strange energy. A visor covered their face, but the presence was unmistakable, a soldier and one not of this world. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the steady pulse of the artifact. Its light flickered erratically, as if it too was aware of the arrival of this new threat. The soldier's gaze swept over the room, landing on Evan with an intensity that made him feel small, insignificant. But it was the alien woman who held his attention. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, but Evan could feel the weight of her fear, the deep sense of urgency that radiated from her. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to ask her who these people were, why they were after her, but the words seemed to escape him. The soldier stepped forward, the sound of their boots grinding against the floor filling the silence. Every movement was calculated, every step purposeful. "You've made a grave mistake, Princess," a voice crackled from behind the visor, cold and detached, like an order being given to a soldier, not a person. The alien woman's body stiffened at the words, her expression turning dark, as though she had heard them countless times before. "I didn't choose this," she replied softly, her voice laced with bitterness, though there was no hint of panic. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of it." The soldier's posture didn't change, but something in their tone shifted, as if their words were weighed down with an unspoken history. "Your actions have consequences. The artifact has activated, and now we must deal with it." Evan watched in stunned silence. He could sense that this wasn't just a conversation. This was a moment of immense importance, something that had been set in motion long before he ever laid eyes on the artifact. The woman was clearly more than she appeared, and the artifact, whatever it was more powerful than Evan could have imagined. "What do you mean, consequences?" Evan asked, his voice shaky but loud enough to catch the attention of both the soldier and the alien woman. His eyes shifted from one to the other, trying to make sense of it all. He was no longer a mere observer in this alien encounter. Somehow, he had been pulled into the center of it all. The soldier's gaze flicked toward him, and Evan instinctively took a step back. But it was the woman's reply that chilled him to the core. "You don't understand, human. This artifact isn't just a relic. It's a weapon, a key to something ancient and powerful. It was never meant for your kind to touch." Evan swallowed, trying to grasp the gravity of her words. He had thought of the artifact as little more than an archaeological discovery, something to study, to decipher. But now it seemed like it was far more, a link to something dangerous, something that had been waiting for the right moment to awaken. The soldier raised a gloved hand, and suddenly a deep, resonating hum filled the room. Evan's stomach twisted with unease as he realized that the artifact wasn't just glowing, it was responding to the soldier. The air around them seemed to thrum, charged with a strange energy, like the room itself was alive, pulsing in rhythm with the mysterious power of the artifact. The alien woman's face remained stoic, but Even could see the flicker of worry in her eyes. "They will come for you," the soldier said, their voice cold and foreboding. "And they will not stop until they have what they want. You cannot escape this fate." The alien woman's eyes hardened, her lips curling into a faint, grim smile. "Then let them come," she whispered. "I'll face them. I'll face whatever it takes. But not alone." Even's mind raced as the tension in the room mounted. Who was this woman? And what had she gotten him into? He wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained for this kind of confrontation. Yet, something deep inside told him that his involvement wasn't a mere coincidence. There was a bond between him and this alien, something he couldn't explain but could feel pulsing through his veins. Perhaps the artifact had chosen him for a reason, or perhaps it was his own curiosity that had led him down this path. Either way, he was in far deeper than he could have ever imagined. The soldier's hand hovered over a device on their belt, and before Even could react, the alien woman lunged forward, grabbing his arm. Her grip was firm, but her touch was not aggressive. It was urgent, like she was pulling him into a world that he was not ready for. "Run," she commanded, her voice sharp and commanding. Now, without hesitation, Even followed her lead, his heart pounding in his chest as the two of them dashed toward the exit. The soldier didn't follow immediately, but Even could feel their presence pressing in on him, like a weight on his chest. He didn't know where they were headed, didn't know what the woman wanted from him, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The world outside the research facility seemed distant, almost unreal, as if he had crossed into another realm entirely. The woman's pace quickened, and Even found himself struggling to keep up. He could hear the soldier's footsteps behind them, growing louder with each passing second, but he didn't dare look back. His mind was focused solely on the woman's command and the pounding of his own heart. They burst through the facility's doors and into the open air, the night sky above them dark and clouded. The woman's hand was still firm on his arm, guiding him through the labyrinth of metal and concrete. Even had no idea where they were going or what would happen next, but one thing was clear: he was now a part of something far greater than himself, and there was no turning back. The artifact had chosen them both, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The night air outside was colder than Even had expected, biting at his skin as he sprinted alongside the alien woman. She led him through the maze of winding corridors, her movements fluid and purposeful, like she had done this 1,000 times before. Despite her quick pace, her grip on his arm remained steady, guiding him through the chaos with an uncanny calm. It was as though she knew exactly where she was going, and Even, caught up in her urgency, had no choice but to follow. They rounded a corner and reached an old service elevator that was barely lit. The woman punched a series of buttons, and the doors slid open with a creak, revealing the dim metallic interior. Without hesitation, she pulled Even inside, and the doors closed just as quickly, trapping them in the small, claustrophobic space. The elevator hummed to life, the low whirring sound filling the silence between them. Even's breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse racing from the sprint, his mind reeling from the series of events that had unfolded in the past hour. He was still trying to process everything: the artifact, the alien woman, the soldier. What was happening? Why was she here? And what did all of this mean for him? The woman stood still, her expression unreadable as she stared straight ahead, her eyes occasionally flickering toward the illuminated floor numbers. Even, however, couldn't shake the question swirling in his mind. "Why did you run?" he finally asked, his voice shaky, the words tumbling out in a rush. What was that soldier after? Who are they, and what do they want with you? She didn't respond immediately, her gaze still fixed on the floor as the elevator descended, each floor passing in quiet succession. Even glanced at her, waiting for an answer, but she remained silent, her lips pressed tightly together. The silence between them stretched long enough that Even began to wonder if she was simply avoiding the question. His frustration grew, but before he could push further, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are hunters. I have been running from them for years." Her voice was distant, as if she were speaking of something far beyond the present moment. "They are after the artifact. And they believe that I am the key to unlocking its power." Even frowned, trying to make sense of her words. "But why you? What's so special about you?" For the first time since they had met, the woman turned her gaze to him, her eyes filled with something that Even couldn't place. "You don't understand," she said, her voice low and heavy with regret. "I am not just anyone. I am of royal blood. My family rules a distant world, one that has been locked in a war for centuries. The artifact is not merely a tool, but a symbol of power, a weapon that can end the war or escalate it to unimaginable levels. I was chosen to protect it, but I failed. That's why they're after me." Even's mind raced as he tried to process her words. A royal, a weapon, a war. It was too much for him to comprehend in the span of a few minutes, and the truth hung in the air like an invisible weight between them. He opened his mouth to ask more questions, but the elevator dinged, signaling their arrival at the bottom floor. Without a word, the woman led him out of the elevator and into a darkened hallway. The walls were lined with metal, their cold surfaces reflecting the sparse light that filtered in from overhead. They moved quickly, Even's confusion growing with every step. The woman was no longer guiding him with her usual calm. Now, there was a sense of urgency in her every movement. They reached a small, unmarked door at the end of the hall, and the woman pushed it open with a quick motion, revealing a cluttered storage room filled with old equipment and discarded tools. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, sterile environment of the lab they had just left. She motioned for him to follow her inside, and Even stepped cautiously through the door, his senses heightened. The room smelled of dust and rust, the air thick with the scent of long-neglected machinery. The woman walked to the far side of the room, her eyes scanning the cluttered shelves. As she moved, Even noticed something strange. There were no windows, no visible exits, and only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting faint shadows on the walls. "We need to hide," she said abruptly, turning back to face him. "The soldiers will be searching for us soon. If they find us, they will take me, and the artifact will be lost." Even nodded slowly, his mind still racing. The gravity of the situation was starting to settle in, and the realization hit him like a wave. He had no idea what was at stake, but he was already in too deep to turn back. And somehow, despite everything, he couldn't help but feel a strange connection to this alien woman. As if reading his thoughts, she turned to him, her eyes meeting his for a brief, fleeting moment. "You don't understand, do you?" she asked quietly, her tone laced with a sadness that Even hadn't expected. "This isn't just about me. The artifact has chosen you. It's linked to you now, and that means they will come after you as well." The words hit Even like a physical blow. He had been so focused on the danger the woman faced that he hadn't considered the fact that he was now part of this story, entangled in something far bigger than himself. The soldier had been after her, yes, but now they were both marked. "What do you mean, linked to me?" he asked, his voice trembling with confusion and fear. The woman sighed softly, her gaze flickering to the artifact that rested in the corner of the room. The faint hum of its energy seemed to resonate in the space around them. "When you touched it, you activated it," she explained. "And in doing so, you've become its protector. But that comes with a price." Even's thoughts were jumbled. What price? She didn't answer immediately, her gaze shifting from the artifact to the cluttered shelves behind her. It was clear that she was choosing her words carefully, weighing the impact they would have on him. Finally, she spoke again, her voice a whisper in the quiet room. "You will be hunted, by people and forces you cannot even begin to comprehend. And once they have you, they will use you to control the artifact." The weight of her words settled over him, a feeling of impending dread settling deep in his chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something much larger, a force of power and destruction he had never even imagined. And it had chosen him. The silence in the small storage room was deafening as the weight of the alien woman's words hung in the air, thick with an urgency that Ivan couldn't shake. He stood there, his mind scrambling to piece together the fragments of the reality he had been thrust into. The artifact, the woman, the soldiers, it was all spiraling out of control. He was no longer just a curious scientist stumbling upon a relic. He was entangled in something far beyond his comprehension, something dangerous and mysterious. And it seemed that there was no way out. The woman was still scanning the room, her eyes flicking to every corner, as if searching for something that Ivan couldn't see. He followed her gaze, noticing the cluttered shelves filled with broken equipment, old research papers, and forgotten tools. It was almost as though this room had been abandoned, left to gather dust and neglect. But now it felt different. It felt like a hiding place, a temporary shelter from something that was closing in on them. Suddenly, the woman moved swiftly, reaching for a small metallic case tucked behind a pile of forgotten electronics. She opened it with precision, revealing a set of small glowing devices. Ivan's eyes widened as she held one up to the light, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface. "These will help us," she said, her voice steady but laced with the same underlying tension that had been there since their escape. "They will mask our presence, for a while at least, but it won't last forever." Ivan took a step closer, his curiosity piqued. "Mask our presence? From who?" "From the soldiers," she replied, her tone grim. "They will be able to track us by the artifact's energy. If we don't use these devices, it won't be long before they find us." The weight of her words hit him again, heavier this time. He had thought they had escaped, thought they were free for the moment, but now he understood. They were running from something far bigger than just a few soldiers. The artifact had set off a chain of events, and now they were both marked targets. Ivan had been pulled into this world, whether he wanted to be or not. He felt like he was drowning in it, unable to escape, unable to breathe without fear. He glanced at the woman, trying to make sense of everything. She seemed so calm, so controlled, but Ivan could see the flicker of concern in her eyes, the tightness in her jaw as she prepared the devices. He wanted to ask her more questions, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth, if he even could handle it, but he knew he didn't have a choice. He had to know. "Who are they?" "The soldiers. I mean, what do they want with you?" His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly at his sides. The woman paused, her gaze briefly meeting his before she turned her attention back to the device in her hand. She didn't respond immediately, her lips pressed into a tight line, as though she were struggling to find the right words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice lower this time, almost regretful. "They are not just soldiers," she said softly. "They are a part of a faction, a group that believes the artifact will give them ultimate control over the galaxy. They are ruthless, relentless. They don't care who they have to kill to get it." Ivan's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing to keep up with her words. Ultimate control over the galaxy. The weight of her statement settled over him like a heavy blanket. It was one thing to be hunted by a group of mercenaries or criminals, but this was something else entirely. The stakes were far higher than he had imagined. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about a battle for power, a battle that could affect everything in the universe. "But why me?" Ivan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did the artifact choose me?" The woman's expression softened, and for the briefest of moments, he saw a flicker of something human, in her eyes. She closed the case with a soft click and stepped closer to him, her voice dropping even lower as she spoke. "It chose you because of your connection to the artifact. It's not just a relic. It's a key, one that can unlock unimaginable power. And you, even, are now its protector." She paused, her gaze hardening. "The artifact recognizes something in you, something I can't explain. But you're not just an observer. You're part of this now. And whether you want it or not, you're tied to it for the rest of your life." Even shook his head in disbelief. A protector? He wasn't some warrior. He wasn't prepared for this. He was a scientist, a researcher. He had never asked for any of this. He had simply stumbled upon an artifact, and now his entire world had turned upside down. His fingers curled into fists at his sides as he fought to steady his racing thoughts. "But I don't want this," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I didn't ask for any of this. I'm just a human. I'm not a soldier. I don't even know how to fight." The woman's eyes softened for a moment, and she placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly warm despite her alien nature. "I know you didn't choose this," she said, her voice quiet but full of understanding. "But sometimes, even, the path we're meant to walk chooses us, not the other way around." He stared at her, his mind still struggling to absorb everything. She was right. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't chosen to be a part of whatever this was. But here he was, caught in the middle of a cosmic struggle that he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. The artifact had chosen him. And now it seemed like there was no going back. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and the woman's head snapped up, her eyes widening with alarm. Without another word, she grabbed Ivan by the arm, pulling him toward the far corner of the room. They crouched low, hiding behind a stack of crates as the footsteps grew louder. Ivan's heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. Through the dim light, he could see her face, her determination, her fear, and in that moment, Ivan realized that she wasn't just trying to protect herself. She was trying to protect him too. They were in this together now, whether either of them liked it or not. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Ivan held his breath, praying they wouldn't be discovered. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, the tension unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, the footsteps moved away, and the door to the storage room remained undisturbed. The woman exhaled slowly, releasing the breath she had been holding. "We need to move," she whispered. "We don't have much time." Ivan nodded, his mind still spinning as they slipped from their hiding place and moved swiftly toward the exit. He didn't know what the future held or where their journey would take them, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back now. They were in this together, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The air outside was thick with an unsettling quiet as Evan and the woman moved swiftly through the narrow, darkened streets of the facility's outskirts. The dim lights flickered above, casting long shadows on the cracked concrete beneath their feet. The sound of distant engines and muffled voices echoed in the distance, but for now, the two of them seemed to be alone, moving through the gloom like shadows themselves. Despite the tension that gripped his chest, Ivan couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing them together. This strange woman, this alien who had appeared out of nowhere, and the artifact that had bound him to her. The feeling was undeniable. He was inextricably linked to all of this, whether he wanted to be or not. She moved quickly, her steps silent and sure, leading him down alleys and through forgotten passages, places Ivan hadn't even known existed in the facility. It was almost as though she had memorized every inch of this place, every turn and hidden doorway. Ivan struggled to keep up with her pace, his thoughts racing faster than his legs could carry him. The soldier, no, the faction, was still out there, searching for them, and they were getting closer with every passing moment. He could feel it in his bones. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice low but filled with urgency. They hadn't spoken since they'd left the storage room, and his mind was still whirling with the gravity of their situation. The woman glanced over her shoulder, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly in the dim light. "We need to get to the secondary hideout. It's a safe house, a place where we can regroup and plan our next move. But it won't stay safe for long." Ivan swallowed hard. And then what? What happens when we get there? Her expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. We wait, we plan, and we prepare for what comes next. What comes next? Even pressed, but the question felt hollow, like an echo in the cavern of his mind. The more he thought about it, the more everything began to feel like an inevitable tide, pulling him under. The woman's gaze flickered toward the horizon, where the distant glow of city lights cast an eerie hue against the night sky. They're not just soldiers. They're part of a much larger force, a faction that controls more than you could ever imagine. If they get their hands on the artifact, they'll use it to dominate entire systems. The balance of power will shift forever. Even couldn't help the shiver that ran down his spine. He had known that the artifact was important, but hearing her speak of it like that, of the kind of destruction it could bring, made him realize how little he truly understood. His mind raced with questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. They reached a secluded part of the complex, a set of dilapidated buildings that seemed forgotten by time. The walls were cracked, and the windows were boarded up, as though they hadn't been touched in decades. It was here that the woman paused, her hand resting against the rusted metal of a door. She didn't speak, but her posture said everything. They had arrived. "Stay close," she instructed, her voice low, but carrying an undeniable sense of urgency. She pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness of the night. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with the remnants of what once must have been a functioning hideout. Old equipment lay scattered about, covered in dust and cobwebs, and the smell of stale air filled the space. Yet there was something strangely comforting about it, as if this place held secrets far older than any of the chaos that had unfolded outside. The woman moved quickly, pulling open a series of drawers and cabinets, as though searching for something. Even stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, his mind still reeling. "What now?" he asked again, the question lingering in the air. Her fingers brushed over a hidden panel on the far wall, and suddenly, a low hum vibrated through the room. A secret compartment slid open, revealing a set of old, worn maps and a collection of communication devices that looked like they belonged to a different era. She picked one up and turned it over in her hands, inspecting it carefully before placing it back down. "We wait for the right moment," she said, her voice distant. "And when it comes, we fight. But we need to understand what we're dealing with first. We need to find out what their next move is." Even looked at her, taking in the seriousness of her words. "And how do we do that?" She turned toward him, her expression dark. "We track them." The words hung in the air, their weight settling over him like a stone. He hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. They were on the run, hiding in the shadows, yet now she wanted to track the soldiers down. It was risky, reckless even, but in the depths of his heart, Even knew she was right. There was no escaping this. Not now. "I don't know how we can," he began, but the woman's eyes met his, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. It was subtle, fleeting, but it was there. She was carrying the weight of something much larger than herself, and the burden was breaking through her usual stoic exterior. "You don't have to understand all of it," she said quietly. "You just have to trust that I know what I'm doing. Trust that we're not alone in this. I know you didn't choose to be a part of it, but now you're in it, Even. We either do this together, or we don't survive." Even felt the gravity of her words sink in. There was no running now. He had stepped into something far bigger than he ever anticipated, and there was no way out. He wasn't just running for his life anymore. He was running with her, part of a larger struggle that he didn't understand. And yet, despite everything, a strange sense of determination sparked within him. She was right. They had to fight. There was no other choice. He nodded, the resolve hardening in his chest. "Okay, what's the plan?" The woman's lips curled into a brief, satisfied smile. "We start by tracking their signal. And then we do what we do best. Survive." As she activated the device, and the faint sound of static filled the room, Even couldn't shake the feeling that the battle for the artifact was just beginning. Whatever came next, it was no longer just about running. It was about survival. And maybe, just maybe, taking the fight to them. The flickering blue light from the tracking device cast long shadows across the cramped room as the woman adjusted the dials, her face set in concentration. The soft hum of the machinery was the only sound, a strange comfort in the otherwise tense silence. Even stood across from her, watching as she worked, still trying to process everything that had happened in the past few days. The weight of it all pressed down on him. He had gone from a researcher, someone who studied the stars and the unknown, to a man thrust into the heart of an intergalactic conflict, hunted by forces he could barely comprehend. And the strange part was, despite his fear, despite the overwhelming sense of being out of his depth, there was also a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling that this was what he was meant to do. The woman's hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting the controls and tuning into frequencies Even couldn't even begin to understand. She glanced up at him once, her gaze sharp and assessing, before returning to the task at hand. "We're getting close," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a certain edge of determination. "The soldiers are tracking us through the artifact's energy signature, and we can use that to pinpoint their location. But we have to be careful. They'll know the moment we've started tracing them back." Even nodded, though he wasn't sure what good careful would do against an enemy who seemed to have every advantage. The artifact had chosen him, yes, but it also seemed to have cursed him. Every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into this strange and dangerous world. He glanced at the woman, her focused expression illuminating the quiet resolve in her eyes. There was a strength in her he hadn't fully understood before, a quiet power that came from years of running, hiding, surviving. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for something far bigger, something that transcended her own safety. He realized with a jolt that he had been swept up in this fight, whether he liked it or not. He wasn't just an observer in her world anymore. He was a participant. "Do you ever stop?" he asked before he could stop himself, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air for a moment before he regretted them, but the woman didn't seem offended. Instead, she looked up, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that almost made him take a step back. "Stop," she repeated, her lips twitching as though she were about to smile, though the smile never quite came. "I don't have the luxury of stopping. Not until this is over." He could see the truth of her words in the way she held herself, in the way every movement she made was calculated and purposeful. She was a woman on a mission, and there was no room for hesitation. Even swallowed, suddenly feeling the full weight of the situation bearing down on him. This wasn't just some accidental encounter anymore. His life, his future, was now intertwined with hers. Whatever came next, whatever dangers awaited them, they would face it together. The beeping of the tracker broke the silence, pulling Evan from his thoughts. The woman's expression tightened as she leaned over the device, her fingers flying over the controls with expert precision. A map appeared on the screen, and a red dot blinked steadily, indicating the location of their pursuers. "They're closer than I thought," she said, her voice low and tense. "We need to move." Evan felt a surge of panic at the thought of running again. They had just barely managed to get away from the soldiers, and now they were being tracked again. His stomach churned with the weight of the decision ahead. Could they outrun them? Could they escape once more? The woman stood, her movements swift and purposeful. "We don't outrun them. We fight," she said, as though reading his thoughts. "This is it, Evan. We've been running long enough. It's time to stop." She turned away from the tracking device, moving to a small chest tucked in the corner of the room. With a quiet grunt, she opened it and began to pull out what appeared to be weapons, small, compact, but unmistakably deadly. She handed him one without hesitation, the cool weight of it in his hands a stark reminder of the reality they were facing. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Evan asked, staring at the weapon, unsure of what to do with it. He had never fired a gun in his life, let alone an alien weapon of unknown origin. Defend yourself, she replied curtly, as if the answer were the most obvious thing in the world. She slid a sleek, metallic piece of armor over her arm, her movements smooth and practiced. She glanced at him again, her eyes softening just slightly. You're part of this now, Even. You need to be ready. He swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He wasn't just a man trying to understand the universe. He was a soldier, whether he was ready for it or not. The sense of helplessness he had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by a flicker of something else, something deep and primal. For the first time, he realized that the woman had been right. He had no choice but to fight. Okay, he said, his voice firm, though his hand still trembled slightly as he adjusted the weapon. What's the plan? She nodded once, a flicker of approval crossing her face. We take the fight to them. The words hung in the air, charged with a promise of something far bigger than either of them. The soldiers, the faction, the artifact. It was all leading them toward this moment. They could no longer hide, no longer run. They had to face the storm head-on. Without another word, she moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at him. Stay close, she said, and the weight of the command settled over him like a shroud. He nodded, gripping the weapon tightly in his hands, and followed her into the dark. The night air outside was colder now, and the quiet seemed to have deepened, the stillness almost suffocating. They moved quickly, blending into the shadows, their steps careful and deliberate. As they approached the target location, Evan's heart began to pound in his chest, a nervous energy crackling through his veins. They were no longer just hiding. They were hunting. The moment they reached the abandoned warehouse where the soldiers were waiting, the woman turned to him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of resolve in her eyes. This is it, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet night. We do this together. No turning back. Even looked at her, the gravity of the situation settling in. They had reached the point of no return. And as he nodded in agreement, he realized that the battle for the artifact, the fight for survival, was just beginning. The war that would shape the fate of entire worlds was about to begin. And this time, they would not run. They would stand and fight. Together. The night was oppressive, a suffocating darkness that seemed to close in around Even and the woman as they crouched behind the debris of an abandoned warehouse, waiting. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, and the only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the occasional rustle of wind through broken windows. It felt as though the world had gone silent in anticipation, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The tension was palpable, an electric current running through the space, making every moment feel like an eternity. Evan's hands trembled slightly, still gripping the alien weapon she had handed him earlier. He wasn't sure what he expected from it. He had never held a weapon before, let alone one of this magnitude. The sleek design was both intimidating and fascinating, its surface smooth and cool, humming faintly in his grip. His mind raced, trying to focus on the task at hand. They weren't just hiding anymore. They were preparing for the inevitable confrontation, the clash that would decide everything. The soldiers were out there, and they had come for the artifact, and for the woman. Beside him, the woman was eerily calm, her focus unwavering as she surveyed the area through a small crack in the wall. Her posture was perfect, every muscle coiled in anticipation. There was no fear in her eyes, only the quiet certainty of someone who had faced this moment 1,000 times before. Even couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for her, but also a growing unease. She was ready to fight. She had always been ready for this, but he was just a man thrown into a war he didn't understand, and the weight of that realization hung heavily on him. She turned to him then, her gaze piercing in the dim light. "You ready?" she asked, her voice steady, as if they were discussing the weather and not the deadly confrontation that was about to unfold. Even opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he simply nodded, the lump in his throat too thick to speak. He wasn't ready. He didn't know if anyone could be. But there was no turning back now. A low sound, a hum, barely perceptible at first, broke the stillness, and the woman's head snapped up. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the distance. The sound grew louder, and soon it was unmistakable, the sound of approaching engines. The soldiers had arrived. Evan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating through his body like a drum. The moment had come. There was no more time for hesitation. The woman's fingers flexed around the hilt of her weapon, and with a brief nod to him, she slipped out from behind their hiding spot, moving with the fluidity of someone who had spent their entire life running, fighting, surviving. Ivan hesitated for just a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him, before he followed her. They moved swiftly, their footsteps quiet but deliberate as they closed the gap between them and the soldiers, who were now gathering just outside the entrance to the warehouse. The faint glow of their armored figures illuminated the space, casting long shadows against the cracked walls. Ivan's pulse quickened as they crept closer, the world narrowing down to the beat of his own heart and the presence of the woman at his side. The woman raised her hand, signaling for him to stop. They were close now, close enough to hear the soldiers' voices as they barked orders to each other. The air was thick with tension, the quiet before the storm. Ivan's mind raced, but he forced himself to focus, to breathe. There was no room for doubt, no time for second-guessing. The woman had said it herself. They were in this together. She turned to him again, her eyes meeting his for the briefest of moments. There was a flicker of something there, something that resembled trust. And in that moment, Ivan understood. She wasn't just fighting for the artifact. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for him too. Without another word, she stepped forward, moving with purpose as she broke from their cover and charged toward the soldiers. Ivan's breath caught in his throat as he watched her go, her every movement a perfect blend of grace and lethal intent. The soldiers barely had time to react before she was upon them, her weapon flashing in the dim light, as she took them down one by one with the precision of a predator. Ivan hesitated for only a moment, his instincts screaming at him to stay back. But then he followed her, his legs carrying him forward on autopilot. He raised his weapon, the cool metal feeling strange and foreign in his grip, but he didn't hesitate. He aimed and fired, the weapon's recoil sending a shock through his body as the first soldier went down. It was all happening so fast, too fast for him to process. But somehow, despite the chaos, he felt a surge of adrenaline that pushed him forward. There was no time to be afraid, no time to think. He moved with the woman, staying by her side as they fought their way through the soldiers. The sounds of blaster fire, the hiss of alien energy weapons, and the cries of the soldiers as they fell filled the air. The warehouse seemed to explode with chaos, but amidst it all, Ivan focused on the woman, following her lead, matching her rhythm, as best he could. The soldiers were beginning to regroup, and Ivan could hear the order being called out. Reinforcements were on the way. But they couldn't wait. They had to finish this, and they had to finish it now. The woman's eyes met his for a split second, and in that brief exchange, Ivan understood what she wanted. The artifact. They had to get to it, and they had to keep it safe. "Cover me," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. Without waiting for a response, she moved toward the center of the warehouse, where the artifact lay hidden. Ivan's heart skipped a beat as he saw the soldiers turning their attention toward her, trying to stop her from reaching it. Ivan didn't think. He acted. He charged forward, his weapon raised, firing at the advancing soldiers. The world seemed to slow as he pushed himself forward, his every movement dictated by the desire to protect the woman, to keep the artifact safe. He fired again and again, his aim improving with every shot. The soldiers fell, one by one, until only a few remained. But they were determined, and they fought back with an intensity that matched their desperation. The woman reached the artifact, her hands moving quickly as she grabbed it, holding it close. Evan's heart raced as he watched her, the sense of urgency growing with every second. They couldn't afford to lose it. They couldn't afford to fail. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the fight came to an end. The remaining soldiers lay scattered around the warehouse, their weapons discarded. The woman stood at the center, breathing heavily, her gaze locked on the artifact in her hands. She turned to Evan, a look of fierce determination in her eyes. "We did it," she said, her voice calm but filled with relief. Evan's heart still pounded in his chest as he lowered his weapon, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. They had won. For now. But the war wasn't over. The artifact was still at the heart of a larger conflict, and the soldiers, no, the faction, would come again. And when they did, they would be ready. Together.